something, 'cause I don't know how this gonna end.
Hi everyone, I just wanted to say thank you to all the people who have subscribed and been subscribed to my channel and voiced their support recently. It really is great encouragement, and it does let me know that this type of content is what you like to see, so thank you again. For this project, I'm starting off with a men's shirt that I'm going to take apart and then use the fabric to create a new design. I did tape all of my style lines this time onto my dress form. Sometimes I forget to do this, but it really does help when patterning pieces to make sure that everything fits together really well. As I'm pinning, I'm also adding darts under the bust and to the side of the bust to give the front bodice some shape. I almost always default to 1/2 inch seam allowance on my designs. I repeated the same draping process for the back of the bodice, starting with one side, pinning the dart, and then I'm going to sew the dart down before moving on to the other side. This will make sure that I can get the darts equally spaced from center back. And for my tape, I'm just using 1/4 inch painter's tape. It's super cheap and it is also easy to see through light colored materials, so it's nice to trace. And it doesn't leave my dress form super sticky, which I know can happen with some of the more expensive dress form tapes. So as I said, I'm sewing down the dart for this one back piece. When I sew darts, I backstitch at the bottom, but I don't backstitch at the top of the dart, and I actually tie the threads so it's nice and pointed and not bulky right at the tip. After I had that dart as a reference, I started to drape the other back piece and measured from center back to make sure that this dart was evenly spaced. Drawing a line from the base of the dart to the tip can help when sewing it on your machine. And for the darts under the bust, I do have them curved ever so slightly at the tip, just so that it fits nicely underneath that area. And this is what it looks like with the dart sewn down, front and back. Now moving on to my neckline, I'm doing the same process I did with the other pieces. The only difference here is that I'm cutting out a second piece to use as a facing so that the inside of the neckline has a nice finish to it. And I am using a fusible interfacing on one of the pieces because it will need that stability. Pretty self-explanatory here, but I'm just pinning the neckline along the bodice, and I'm going to be sewing French seams for pretty much every seam in this piece because I'm not using a lining, so I want the inside to be nice and finished. To do this, I'm pinning the wrong sides together. Normally seams are sewn with the right sides together, but I want the wrong sides together so that the first raw edge is facing on the outside of the garment, and then you'll see what the next steps will be. A trick to pinning curves together is to cut little notches within your seam allowance, and then that'll help you to easily manipulate that piece to fit the curve. So again, this is going to be a French seam. I have blue tape on my sewing machine marking 3/8 of an inch. Remember that my seam allowance is 1/2 inch pretty much everywhere. So I'm doing 3/8 of an inch on this first seam, and then for it to be a French seam, I'm going to cut off the excess fabric as close to this stitching as possible. You can see here I cut it down to about a 1/16 of an inch, and then I'm folding it over and pinning it down and then sewing again about 1/8 of an inch to complete that 1/2 inch seam allowance and also trap that raw fabric inside this new seam. So you can see here, this is what the French seam looks like all complete, and this is the inside of the shirt. And it just looks like a normal seam from the outside. I repeated that same process for the neckline at the back of the bodice, and then I moved on to sewing the side seams again using a French seam. You can see the inside of the top is really clean with those French seams. There's no frayed edges, and everything looks very professional. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the top of the shoulder. And moving on to the center back panel, this one's a little bit more unique because I'm going to be doing 2 shirred panels and a zipper in the center back. So to preserve as much of the fabric as possible, I'm just using a scrap of muslin to draft out this shirred piece. And my rule of thumb when doing shirring is to make the piece at least twice as wide as you want the finished piece to be. So I'm basically cutting it in half and splitting those 2 pieces with the width of this single piece itself. And the extra trick here was continuing with that diagonal silhouette up to the one shoulder. So I'm marking the low point and the high point so that I know when it scrunches together and it's not expanded, that the angle will still hold true and I can connect it to my back bodice piece. So I did this for both of the shirred panels on the back, making sure to hem them at the top and bottom, and I serged the inside edge more for time saving, but this is the area that will be hidden underneath the panels of the zipper. So you can also do a hemmed edge there, it doesn't need to be serged. Regardless, I'm winding up my bobbin with my elastic thread, and I always have my shirring thread that I use linked down in the description. And then I'm just sewing rows of stitching on the top side of the fabric, so you're technically top stitching when you're doing shirring, at a 1/2 inch apart in sort of a switchback motion until I reach the bottom. So the only separating zipper I had was like 22 inches long, so I needed to cut it down to be the right length for my shirt, which meant I had to sew some zipper stops at the top of the zipper and cut it down to fit. And then I'm pinning and sewing my 2 shirred panels together with a regular seam and a basting stitch because these stitches will be ripped out after the zipper is sewn down. I also interfaced the zipper because the tension from the shirred panel pieces will be pulling on it, so I just wanted to make sure that it was not going to rip out anywhere. And then I carefully lined up the center of the zipper with the center seam of the shirred pieces and pinned it down. And then with a zipper foot or a piping foot would do just the same thing. I am sewing along each side of the zipper, back stitching at the front and back.
Maybe I am too naive, but I'm choosing to believe that you will give me another chance. Oh, so tell me now.
To add the back panel to the bodice, I'm just sewing again, wrong sides together to get that same French seam and repeating that process for both sides. It's also not on camera, but I did hem the bottom of the bodice. I serged it and then folded it up and top stitched down. So I wanted to have an exaggerated silhouette for this sleeve since there was only one of them. So working with a men's shirt is tricky in that you're limited to how much fabric you can use. So I had to get creative and I basically deconstructed both sleeves to combine them to make one sleeve. And I'm making a balloon sleeve, so I'm tracing the existing sleeve shape and then slashing and spreading the pieces to give me a more full silhouette. I'll leave the video I used as reference down below if you're interested in how to do this. And then I essentially just pieced the parts of both sleeves together in a way that was symmetrical, but also that could fit this larger sleeve pattern. I sewed all these pieces together with a French seam, and then I cut out the sleeve pattern. Then the sleeve was just sewn together at the side with a French seam. So I did compromise on length of the sleeve to fit the width that I wanted, so I did need to add a cuff, and I'm just using some remaining scraps that I had, kind of stitching those together with a French seam again and hemming it because I'm going to shirr it. Using the same techniques as I did before. And this is what the cuff looks like. I left one edge raw because that's the one that's going to be sewn into the sleeve. And then moving my machine to the longest stitch width to do 2 rows of basting stitches at the top of the shoulder of the sleeve and then at the cuff, because you can see I had to gather it. One, that gives it a more full dramatic look, and it also helps it fit the cuff and will help you set the sleeve in the bodice as well. So I'm just lining up my seams where I need to and pinning around. And I am repeating the same process for the sleeve in the bodice, making sure the wrong sides are together, matching the top of the sleeve with the shoulder seam and the bottom of the sleeve with the side seam, and then pinning my way around. And since it's gathered, you can adjust the gathers to make sure that it fits the same circumference of the armhole. And that's all for the construction of the shirt, and this is the finished look.
Can't get enough. I try my best to look away, but I can't stop. Am I a freak to you? We almost touch. I feel your body move my way, you're close enough. So I say